Every dungeon master has a bad player at some point. A lot of them could be power gamers, rules lawyers, psychos, perverts. It could even be somebody's significant other. And in this case, it was definitely someone's significant other. What brings this player to mind is they are by far possibly the worst player I've ever had in any of my games. In the 20 plus years that I've been running Dungeons & Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade, Rifts, and any other game that came into my purview, this one player definitely stands out in a class of their own. In fact, if I tried to slap a label on them, I wouldn't be able to. Well, not by the standard definitions anyway. Perhaps this person could be labeled as a lump, for that's what they really were in the game session. So to give a little bit of background, the game started off thematically as a mistaken identity kind of deal. However, the players had all lived previous lives and had died due to some sort of circumstances beyond their control and wound up in the afterlife. One player actually questioned me about this, and I told him, well, maybe it's because the story of your life hasn't really been written. Perhaps you've never fulfilled your true destiny. He gave me an aha moment, and I was allowed to continue on that one. But for the most part, everything went smoothly beforehand. I did a one-on-one session with each player to make sure I could get a feel for their character before a game truly began, so I would know what kind of monsters to introduce or what kind of quests that they would be most interested in. Were they in it for the loot? Were they in it for the glory? I just wanted these things down first. Well, eventually, game time rolls around and everybody's getting all propped up and ready to go, when one of my players walks in and says, "Hey, my girlfriend would like to play." To me, this was a kind of a red flag, because usually when girlfriends want to play, or significant others, they're mostly there just because their significant other is there, and they usually don't provide much to the overall game experience for the rest of the group. But we needed a fourth, and I allowed it. After all, it was his house, and who am I to say no? So his girlfriend had already written up this druid who was neutral in alignment, and that was another red flag. Most people usually play neutral as a leaf on the wind who doesn't care and lets everybody else just tell them what to do. So already I've got 2 red flags before anything even goes forward. So I ask her a little bit about her character, and she has no background set up. Yet another red flag. So she's true neutral, she has no background, and she's only there pretty much because her significant other happens to be a member of my game group. Now, mind you, this particular girl had experience with role-playing before. Her brother is an avid role player. Her boyfriend's an avid role player. Her boyfriend's roommate is an avid role player. She's surrounded by role players, so she should know what to expect. After getting nothing from her for her character's background, I was put on the spot to make some shit up and go. So I did. Basically, we started out that she was a member of a druid circle out in the forest who shunned technology and shunned the city, and basically lived as far away from city folk as possible. She agreed that this was a good intro, basically by sitting there and doing nothing. So I continued along. Everybody else had agreed, that it was time for her one-on-one session to establish her character, let me get a feel for what she wanted out of the game, and then I could run the storyline proper. So I open up with her druid circle being out in the forest one day encounters mysterious murder. One of the druid circle had been murdered by a savage beast. I ask her, "What do you do?" She decides to wander around the forest a little bit, doesn't investigate the murder. She doesn't even look at the story hook. She just wanders aimlessly around the druid camp. I assumed that in character she was only staring at a tree, because all I had sitting across from me in a beanbag chair was this girl staring at me, blank-faced and expressionless. So I continue along. I'm like, okay. Well, a few days pass. The rest of the druids have buried the body. They're investigating the death of one of your family members. Yet another body turns up, savaged in a similar way, according to rumor, within your circle. Again, I prodded her with the "what do you do" question. She sat there, staring at me, blank-faced, doing nothing. Everybody else in the group is sitting in the living room at this point, kind of giving a slightly nervous chuckle and looking at me like they expect me to basically hold her hand all throughout the game, or at least expect her to do something, anything. But she doesn't, so I assume she's still standing there staring at trees, basically being a lump. I tell her again, well, since you didn't do anything, more time passes. A couple more bodies out of your druid circle turn up, and now there's only half of you left. They ask you for help in burying the bodies, which I'm assuming you do because these are your forest sisters and your forest brothers. Or do you do something else? And I wait. Finally she says, "Sure, I do that." Still blank-faced, sitting there, staring at me. She doesn't make any decisions on her own. and roughly 15 to 20 minutes have passed by this point of her just sitting there staring at me. At this point I can tell we're already getting nowhere real fast, so I fast-track the number of deaths that are taking place on a daily basis. Eventually her entire druid circle is wiped out, and still, her response to this entire thing is sitting there, staring at me, doing nothing. No concern, no questions, nothing. She didn't ask anything about her druid circle, she didn't investigate the deaths, she did nothing, except sit there. And when I asked her questions, all she did was roll with anything I suggested at that point. Of course, by this time I was rather frustrated, but I had to hold my composure. I decided at that point also to kind of jimmy my own rules a little bit. Up until this, everybody had randomly rolled which afterlife they wound up in. The paladin wound up in Pandemonium. The monk wound up in Celestia. The cleric, he wound up in the Abyss. Everybody had wound up in an afterlife that just wasn't quite right for their alignment. But for her, I couldn't help it. So the next thing she realizes is this weird, distinct feeling that her consciousness is falling through a great void. Eventually, she snapped to as water splashes across her spiritual form, and she's in a great underground lake. The sky itself seems a strange, ruddy purple red. The sounds of screams and horror and terror echo through the wind. She doesn't know where she's at, but even the water itself gives off a sinister feel. Nearly everybody in my group had been pretty quick to figure out where she wound up. I ask her, well, you're in a deep lake. You can't see the bottom. Even though the water is strangely clear, it hisses a little bit at you, and you get a sinister feeling from the water. Again, I prod her with the standard question that I ask players when I pause to get their bearings. What do you do? She looks at me, blank face, shrugs a little bit, and tells me, I guess I'll float for a while. The amount of times I internally facepalmed at this juncture is immeasurable. However, the story must continue. I've got 3 other players sitting in the room waiting to get the game going so they can actually have some adventuring time. I then inform her that the lake itself is caustic. It's burning away her clothes and her skin. So she swims to shore finally, deciding that staying in the lake is not a good idea. She gets to the shore and starts walking up to the beach. By this point, she's almost completely naked, her clothes are in tatters, and her skin is slightly burned away. But she begins regenerating ever so slightly, just because, well, hell doesn't let souls escape that easy. I describe to her that she's on a great beach made of black sand. I don't even have to give her a roll since she's a druid. I tell her it's made of crushed obsidian. It cuts like daggers as you walk across it. What do you do? She sits there, blank-faced, and tells me that she guesses that she's going to go for a walk for a little while. I tell her after about 5 minutes her feet are so cut up and bloody that it's hard for her to actually stay mobile from the blood loss. She feels faint and dizzy from the amount of cuts that she's getting from the ankles on down. It's crushed obsidian after all. So now she decides to leave the beach and just wander further inland. Finally, are we getting progress? After a while of adventuring, I tell her what feels like days. She happens to see a city in the distance. There are vrocks flying above in the sky, Meriliths and Baelors whipping and flensing people in the streets. The cries of terror and screams that she heard in the air when she first came to this realm must be coming from this place, and the wind carries their pain to other places, so all may know where they are. What do you do? She stands there. She ponders, blank face, staring at me. Finally, I break down a little bit at this point. I'm like, look, there's a town in front of you. You see demons torturing people, or you can continue walking along through the endless void until you find something else. She pauses for a moment and eventually says, I go into town. I want to find an inn. That uncountable amount of face-palming that I've internalized earlier has now doubled. So she starts walking towards the demons. One of the oversized greater demons, who's busy getting a little frisky with some Meriliths and human blood and pain and those sorts of things that go on in hell, spots her and screams out in a great bellowing voice, Fresh meat! She decides to keep walking towards town. So I set up a battle scenario that an endless horde of demons is now running towards her, most of them at full tilt, overjoyed at the fact the new soul has come to hell, a new plaything. The druid finally takes the initiative to take at least one action. She summons a bear. Mind you, I was happy that she actually did something for a change, but summoning a bear to engage in combat when I had already told her that The number of demons rushing towards her numbers in the hundreds, but she summons her bear and rolls initiative after I ask her to roll initiative. I wasn't even going to bother with rolling each demon's initiative individually or cracking open the books to find which demons were going to attack first. I just threw a Baylor claiming that he would have the first stab at the fresh meat. The Baylor walks up, beating the bear's initiative handily, but it rolls surprisingly low for damage. It strikes at the bear, doing about 3/4 damage. Called shot, arm. The bear's arm goes flying off. The bear roars in pain. I look at her and I go, "It's your turn." Mind you, the bear had lost 3/4 of its hit points and a limb. She basically makes this weird noise as she talks, and she's like, "Well, I guess my bear is pretty angry right now." Unfortunately, this elicited some muffled laughter from the rest of the people in the room, as I replied, "Your bear is in dire need of morphine right now." Still, she makes her bear attack. It misses horribly, and gets skewered into oblivion on the next turn. The demons capture her, chain her up, and begin torturing her for the rest of eternity after that. The player gets up and walks out of the room. Her boyfriend is, "Wait, where are you going?" And she replies, "Well, I'm dead." Worst player ever.